This is the Social Change Agency podcast. Hello and welcome to the Social Change Agency podcast. I'm Kate, the Communications Manager here. In this episode, I'm excited to be sitting down with Hannah Paterson, a Churchill Fellow exploring participatory grant making. There's a growing understanding that narrowly defined prescriptive approaches to funding and commissioning may no longer be the most effective ways to address many of the social challenges we face. Participatory grant making is a means of putting funding decisions into the hands of those affected by the decisions. Done right, it can fundamentally shift power, blurring the traditional roles of funder and grantee. Hannah's spent the last 5 or 6 years researching and practicing participatory grant making, so we're very happy to have her here with us today to tell us more. Hi Hannah, thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Do you think you could first off just introduce yourself and talk a bit about how you came to be such a champion for participatory grant making?
Yeah, so my name is Hannah Paterson. I'm a Churchill Fellow. So about a year ago I was offered the opportunity to travel around South Africa and the USA to explore best practice in participatory grant making through the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust. But before I did that, I was really interested in participatory grant making from a kind of personal perspective. I grew up in the disability movement and the disabled people's movement, and the big caveat around, or not caveat, but purpose-driven value of the disabled people's movement is nothing about us without us, and a lot of my career trajectory has revolved around that kind of like impetus. I then went on to work for the National Lottery Community Fund, and through that was exploring different ways of grant funding and how we could put people in the lead, and we developed the Leaders with Lived Experience programme, which was a completely participatory approach. It involved over 70 leaders with lived experience, so people with first-hand experience of a social issue who are then using that to create change for others in a similar situation. And we worked with about 70 lived experience leaders to completely design the funding programme, and then involved leaders with lived experience in the decision making, and also in the learning and support after the grants were made. So in the grant management we have a learning partner who supports those grant holders to really understand how they can network, what they're learning from each other as a kind of cohort, how they're all getting on. So those were kind of like the driving factors around doing the fellowship and exploring more about participation.
Great, and I guess you've kind of touched on some of it there in terms of like nothing about us without us, and also a network of people with lived experience of the topic that you're working in. But what are some of the common issues that you see in the grant making space?
I think in grant making there's lots of kind of like different ways of approaching it and different ways of doing it, and I think sometimes you can fall into a assumption that grant makers have all of the knowledge because we hold purse strings, and I'm not sure that's necessarily the true. And I think through participatory grant making, the thing that's really interesting is actually you can really utilise a kind of collective knowledge base and improve the decisions that you make, because you can bring people in from different expertise. So you can have people from a funding background who understand management accounts and finances and due diligence and fraud and that aspect of it, but you can also involve people from communities that understand actually what's happening on the ground, and the mashup of those kind of skills and insights can make the grants that you make much stronger. Whereas if you have just a group of people from one kind of like viewpoint or background, then you come at decisions from that viewpoint and background, and I think you can always make stuff stronger by kind of diversifying who's in the room.
Yeah, definitely. So you travelled abroad to compare the funding landscape in South Africa and America. What were your kind of key insights? How are they doing it differently?
Yeah, it was really interesting. So I spent 2 weeks in Johannesburg with one foundation. So I was with the other foundation, who are a foundation who support lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, intersex and queer people. And they fund projects that improve the rights of those individuals in the 13 southern countries in South Africa. And that was incredible, and it was really, really interesting because a lot of the funders for the other foundation are international funders. and that's where their money comes from and from individual donations, but the work that they do is completely driven by people from those communities, from those countries, understanding kind of like the diversity of experience. So in those 13 countries, you've got some where it's illegal to be homosexual, some where same-sex marriage is still is legal. So the difference in context is massive, and like some really, really difficult challenges across those spaces. So having individual peer reviewers from those countries, from those communities, deciding what grants should go through was a really, really interesting way of them kind of like being able to access that knowledge and make decisions that was best for those communities, rather than somebody from abroad or from South Africa making decisions on different places. So that one was really, really interesting and really fascinating because of the conversations around international aid and what that looks like, and the kind of white saviour approach, and kind of some of the issues that have come about with kind of safeguarding and international funding at the moment. And the other foundation was quite an interesting model around that. So that was that kind of context. And then the US, I spent it travelling, so I was in Boston, New York, Washington DC and San Francisco, and I met with over 40 individuals around kind of like their different ways of funding, different models, different approaches. One of the recurring themes in the US, and one of the kind of like main drivers for a lot of this, is around the conversations that are bubbling around where wealth comes from, wealth inequality, kind of decolonising wealth, and the fact that wealth inequality is often developed or exacerbated by the exploitation of working class, of slavery, of colonisation, and how do you use philanthropy as a means to kind of like enable some of that transparency, or like how do you break philanthropy's kind of like inherent secular nature of this kind of like not knowing where money comes from. It comes from inequality, and then like, oh, you can have a few crumbs to try and fix the problems that actually have probably been created by a lot of that kind of like immoral investment. So there's lots of that conversation going on in the US, which has really driven a lot of the participatory grant making stuff there, which is fascinating. There's a really interesting book called Decolonising Wealth that everybody was talking about while I was there. That was really interesting and a great read.
So that's kind of feeding the conversation there. Do you feel like there's a similar like wellspring of awareness happening in the UK, or is there a different focus? Is it more about, I don't know, sharing power or connecting communities to decision makers? I mean, that feels like a huge kind of historic context that they're drawing from.
Yeah, and I think the UK has that historic context, but we don't talk about it. Like our part and place that we played in colonising the world and in slavery is huge, and we just don't talk about it. We don't teach about it. When you ask people about it, everyone's like, it was a great thing, without understanding like what that meant for communities and countries and people across the world. So that conversation is not as prevalent in the UK. I mean, it's being had by some people who are like doing amazing work, but nobody's really listening, and I think that's a massive difference. I think in the UK a lot of this stuff is being driven by some really incredible campaigns, so the Charity So White stuff that's going on at the moment, and the conversations about kind of like diversity and equity and inclusion, and looking at kind of like the movements around diversifying boards. So you've got the Young Trustees movement and various others who are talking about the fact that like 90% of trustees are white men over 60 with spare time in their hands, how do you start to understand that's a thing? I think there's also definitely something around Brexit happened for lots of different reasons, but one of those is that people perceive power to be sitting outside of the UK and being made in ivory towers miles away in different countries, and not in their communities. And actually some of the way that we can start to repair some of that is to move power, move conversations and like decision making back into people's kind of like neighbourhoods and communities, so that they can see where that's happening and be transparent about it. So I think there's slightly different drivers from the three different countries, but overlap and probably shared conversations across them.
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you feel like now is a bit of there's a gaining momentum, it's a bit of a tipping point in those conversations from like the amount of time that you've worked in the field? Do you think it's gaining traction? I
think so. I think there's lots of different things that are kind of coming together, and some incredible people doing some kind of really, really good work to highlight these issues and call it out, and then there's a bit of a kind of like, what do we do about it? How do we do that? And I think that's where my research and the participatory grant making stuff is a really good example of like, this could be a solution. Well, not the only solution, because it needs to be seen as like a collective, like participatory grant making is not going to solve a foundation's problem with its lack of diversity in its staff team, but it is an opportunity to kind of start those conversations and start to understand like shifting of power, and that is not as terrifying as some people might think it might be.
You've written a bit about some of the dangers of I guess a tokenistic approach to diversity or to participatory grant making, or one of these other, well, what can become a buzzword. Do you want to talk a bit more about some of those dangers?
Yeah, so I think there's a few. So this is a relatively new thing for the foundation world. There are foundations and funders that have been doing this for years. So the Edge Fund is an excellent example. They've been around for 8 years. All of their stuff is done through participatory grant making. They're really small, grassroots, volunteer-led. And they've been doing it for years. But for the more traditional kind of like funders, it's a really interesting and new space for them. So there is a challenge or a concern or a worry that this is the new flash in the pan. We do it for a little bit, we test some stuff, we maybe develop some programs, and then that's it, you move on to the next thing. So a lot of the conversations is around, actually, do we want to embed this? And if we do, how do we do that? So that's kind of one of the concerns. I think the second is that because it's a buzzword, everybody is wanting to jump on it, and therefore going for maybe the most popular approach that they've heard of. Oh, this is how I've heard that we do participatory grant making, so we're just going to do a big community vote thing, or this is how such and such has done it, I'm just going to apply that to my work, and it didn't quite work out, and we'll just stop doing that now. So being really, really clear about kind of why you're doing it and how you're doing it, so that you're not just bringing in people for kind of like tokenistic consultations, or saying you're doing participatory grant making because that's the new thing that we need to tick off the list. So really, really embedding it in there. I think there's other concerns around that you shouldn't really do participatory grant making if you don't have the kind of like that value based and principle based to make it really embedded. And there's definitely stuff around, actually, what are you asking people to decide on, and there's topics that communities might not be the best place to make a decision on, and when and why are you using participatory grant making? Are you just using it because you should, or are you using it because it's right, or are you using it because it's the kind of best model to use? So one of the good examples of that is like urgent action funding. So if you are rolling funding out within 24 hours or 10 days, that's a really difficult approach to get people involved in those decision makings, and there's actually quite an unfair expectation to put on communities and volunteers that they turn stuff over that quickly. But you might want to involve them in the kind of like strategy and development of what that urgent action fund could be. Or maybe it's funding around something that's kind of like really technical, so some form of engineering or research or medical or digital, or something that maybe the skills aren't there in a community, but you might want to involve experts from that sector to make that decision rather than a foundation. So there's different ways of doing it, and it's just about recognising that you don't just automatically jump to participatory grant making, and you don't just automatically jump to community vote versions of participatory grant making, because there's loads of different ways of doing it, and trying to work out what the best one is for the best reason why you're doing it is a good starting point.
Yeah, that makes sense. On the flip side, can you maybe talk about a time that it's gone really well in your experience?
Yeah. So the Leaders with Lived Experience programme at the National Lottery Community Fund was a really, really fantastic way of doing it. It's definitely hands down the best thing that I've been involved in my kind of 4 years in funding, and then just generally in my working career is probably absolutely a highlight. And a lot of that was around, how do you bring people from really, really different backgrounds to learn from each other and discuss and deliberate and come to decisions that you can be proud of, even if they weren't the decisions that you thought you were going to make when you went into the room. So often when you give people kind of like, here's however many applications that you're going to read, you'll always have favourites. You'll be like, that's the one that I'm going to fight for, or whatever. And then when you got in the room and you hear other people's experiences and you understand why they have made, or why they think a certain way about, you can completely open your mind. And I think having more opportunities where you bring people from different backgrounds together to share their insights and understanding and knowledge in that collective way is an incredible way to help communities strengthen themselves, understand, make better funding decisions, make funding decisions that you wouldn't necessarily fund, support communities that wouldn't necessarily get funding for lots of different reasons, and just make really interesting and good grant making decisions. And we've seen that through the programme. Some of the grant holders for the Lived Experience Leaders programme, it was a small grant, they were £50,000, but the outcomes that they've had, we were talking to one of them last week, Scottish Recovery, they've basically managed to get the Scottish Government to commit to lived experience leadership in all of its work around recovery with regards to death and kind of death related to addiction or recovery. And that's incredible, and it was a really small grant, but that ability to do stuff that maybe wouldn't have happened if we hadn't funded in that way is really exciting.
And if you could give some advice to a grant maker thinking, I'm hearing about participatory grant making, I think this is a thing that I want to get involved in, but as you say, there's so many different ways to go about it, what would be your kind of top tips or your first steps to make sure that you don't just jump on a boat for the sake of it?
Yeah, so I've got a blog that's coming out about top tips at some point soon. So you can keep an eye
we'll
on
signpost people to that when that comes out.
But the first one is that you aren't the first organisation that's trialling this, and I think a lot of people are like, oh, this is new, we're the only ones doing it, and that you don't have to be the first ones to kind of like reinvent the wheel. There are there's loads and loads and loads of funders who are in this space at the moment, trialling stuff, failing, succeeding. You can learn from that kind of body of work. So linking into the different conversations that are happening around participatory grant making, and Losing Controls conference is a really good example of that. But there are other kind of networks and people that are kind of having these conversations. Part of my fellowship is about how to help embed this work across the UK. So I'm here to support and help, and more than happy to have a chat, go for coffee, chat over email, whichever's easiest to kind of support thinking around how you might want to do that. So that's kind of the big one. The second one is, again, like being really clear about what's the driver for this work. Is it an external pressure? Is it something around kind of charity so white? Is it about like diversifying what you're funding? Is it about accessing organisations or areas or communities that you don't fund before? Is it about strengthening the sector? Is it about increasing your reputation as a funder? Like being really honest about what it is that is making you or pulling you towards this model is the starting point, rather than picking what model of participatory grant making you want to use, because there are loads of different ways of doing participatory grant making. There's about 8 or 9 different models, and you can mash them up and do them in different ways, so not just automatically jumping to kind of the one that you've heard most about as the answer for a problem that you haven't quite decided is the problem yet. So being really clear on that will really help you work out what you want to do.
That was Hannah Paterson talking about participatory grant making. Check out her Twitter at @PatersonHannah, and if you look for her on Medium, you'll find she's also a prolific and articulate blogger. How best to change the funding and commissioning landscape is something we at SCA are constantly exploring through our work, conversations, and broader networks we run like Losing Control. If it's an area you're interested in, do get in touch with us. We're more than happy to talk. Our Twitter is @SocialChangeAG. We have a monthly newsletter you can sign up to on our website, thesocialchangeagency.org, or a good old email would suffice. I'm Kate at thesocialchangeagency.org. Don't miss the next episodes of our podcast. We've got more on innovative funding and commissioning approaches, as well as lots of other inspiring change makers. Thanks for listening.